All right, so welcome back, grade 9s. This is lesson number 4, inside the justice system. Inside the justice system is the second chapter of our textbook, and you would think that there's a nice correlation with that first chapter. In the first chapter, we looked at the 3 branches of government, and one of them was the judicial branch. So the judicial branch, although mentioned in that first chapter, is now going to be expanded in this second chapter. So we're going to have lots of connection with that. Now, one thing I'd like to point out, just as we get started here, maybe I'll close the door. One of the questions that you might see on your quiz, or not quiz, evaluation I should call it, because it's class mark. One of the questions that you will see actually on the evaluation next Monday is this idea of why is justice depicted as being blind? You know, what's the significance of the statue that represents justice? Why is she shown as being blind? So this Greek statue here, the statue of justice, is wearing a blindfold so as not to treat friends differently than strangers, or rich people better than the poor ones. The idea here is that justice needs to be objective. It needs to be impartial. Impartial means that there's no favoritism, there's no bias. So if a friend of mine is the judge, and we have a civil suit between you and I, hopefully that judge listens to the evidence and judges independent of the relationship to me. Ignoring their relationship, their pre-existing relationship, to a part of the trial that they're deciding over, they need to make a verdict. So the idea that justice is blind is meant to be showing us that it's impartial, that there is no bias. So in your notes, you might have down chapter 4, inside the justice system, and your first note is probably something like, justice is depicted as being blind, and that doesn't mean that they're blind in the sense that, you know, they ignore stuff, right? You know, oh man, you're blind to reality. Sometimes people say that, right? Like maybe Edmonton Oilers fans are blind to the reality that their team lacks, you know, proper goaltending or sound defense. That's not how the word blind is being used here. When justice is shown as being blind, it is meant to be justice is impartial. Justice is impartial so that you can have a fair trial. So let's say that in a certain circumstance that, you know, Connor McDavid was driving his vehicle in Edmonton and he ran into you as a pedestrian. So you were a pedestrian and he hit you. You'd hope that you could have a fair trial, even though Connor McDavid's a famous person that people like. You'd hope that his celebrity status doesn't impact the trial procedure. Or, looking at it differently, you would hope that his wealth doesn't influence the outcome. Now, Connor McDavid makes more than $10 million a year. I'm going to assume that you don't. So hopefully his economic power and his social status don't contaminate the outcome of the trial. So the first point that we have is justice is seen as blind, meaning impartial. And that's key to fair trial. So in an authoritarian state, in a dictatorship, a state like Stalin's USSR, justice was not impartial. That the purpose of the justice system was to do the bidding of the dictator. So justice wasn't impartial, justice was very biased in favor of the dictator. So Stalin had millions of people purged, killed, and they were guilty of no crime. Many of them were being executed, and on their way to being executed, an execution that they were sure was coming, they were still screaming their loyalty to Stalin. But their justice system had been compromised because it wasn't blind. It was very focused. It was just an extension, an arm of the power and the authority of Stalin. So that is key. Another thing that we're looking at here is, you know, what is justice? So saying that justice is blind, that it's impartial, that's one thing. But in order to really establish the nuances of this term that is central to this chapter, we should be talking about, whoa, take a step back then. What is this justice? What is justice? So there's many ways to define terms. One way to look at the term, what is justice, is to say it's to be treated how you want to be treated and how you treat others. That's how you might see that is just. So what is just? Just is to be treated as you wish to be treated, and how you treat others. So if you go back in mankind's shared history, in this narrative that we call history, you can come across slogans like an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That's justice. The idea that if you wrong me, then my retribution, the consequences of your crime, needs to be reciprocal, right? It needs to be reflective of the crime that's been committed. What is justice? Some people might define justice as enforcing the law to protect our rights. That's justice. So in Canada, what is justice? Enforcing a law to make sure that we have our individual rights. Now, unfortunately, the chapter on individual rights is our next chapter. So you might be sitting there somewhat unclear as to what your individual rights are. But our fundamental rights, which are the ones that are most recognizable, are things like the freedom of movement, and the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, meaning that you can belong to groups, freedom of assembly, meaning that you can gather. So justice may be seen as this idea that we can protect our rights and freedoms. Justice might be this idea that we need to be treated based on our actions, not being treated based upon some kind of prejudice. So don't treat someone based upon some kind of preconceived racism, some preconceived stereotypes. That's not justice. You know, there used to be signs, even in communities like here in Wetaskiwin, in stores that would say, Irish, need not apply. You know, help wanted, Irish, need not apply. So we need to hire someone, but we don't want to hire an Irish person, because Irish people are not dependable. Because you'll get your paycheck and then you'll go drinking and we won't see you again. So that was the stereotype based on prejudice, based on racism that Irish people faced in multiple cities for generations. Justice would be eliminating that kind of stuff. You don't want to go into a store and they look at you differently because of your ethnicity, because of your culture. And yet that does happen, even here, places like Wetaskiwin still, depending upon which visual minority you're part of. What is justice? Applying laws that exist fairly, something to follow in deciding innocence and guilt. Justice is looking at the rules and standards of a society. That justice is, one of those key pillars of a society. So if you were building a new country, a new society, a new community, so soon mankind is going to be expanding, and we'll have colonies on Mars. There's a livable space in the atmosphere of Venus that maybe yesterday they announced that there's life already there. So there's places in the known solar system and the known universe that can sustain life. And as we move there, as our first communities are developed, they'll have to ask themselves, what's the foundation of this community? What's the cornerstone? What's the bedrock of this community? Why do we exist? And a part of that, why do we exist, is justice. What are the rules and standards of this society? What are the collective values that we want? Justice. There's lots of stuff in history about justice. You can look at Plato and his book, The Republic, and there's some other reflections up there as well. Justice means giving to each other what is owed, whether it's good or bad. Justice is perhaps can be manipulated by the strong. So that's a more, in terms of today, a more negative way of seeing it. So on the evaluation next week, we'll have a question about the idea of justice being blind. And we've also just explored the idea that the term justice itself is subject to interpretation. There are some people that see it differently. So next up, as we go to page 2 of our online lesson, you can see that there's already notes from this chapter in the textbook. So this textbook is 15 years old. And therefore, for the last 15 years, there have been a lot of hardworking, creative teachers around this province putting digital resources online. So it's easy to find stuff. So online, you can find a copy of the online textbook. So if you're ever at home and you don't have your textbook, that's why I put those links into each of these lessons. Here's your textbook. You can see a digital copy. But we also have notes on the chapter. And we're about to spend some time looking at some of the notes of the chapter so we can see the big picture. Then we'll go for our break. Our break may be a couple minutes late, but we'll still get our 10 minutes. And then we will come back from the break and have some questions. Then when we hit the wall of questions, we'll try to add some contemporary significance to this topic. So, in terms of these resources, we have this one here. I'm going to fly through it a little bit. So I don't think we need to belabor it. Some of it's going to be applying to like assignments that we're not going to be able to do, group work assignments that are not conducive to this pandemic situation. So one thing that we're going to be learning in this chapter is that in Canada we have a Youth Criminal Justice Act, the Ycga, and the Youth Criminal Justice Act is the biggest part of this chapter as it applies to you today. So there will be a time in the near future that you will be an adult in Canada. You'll be 18, and the Ycga won't apply to you anymore. But being that our grade 9 students are 13, 14-ish years old, then we've put this content into this chapter. So all youth ages 12 to 17 will be required to inform their local government agent about any travel outside of their community. This is to reduce the problems related to the recent rise of gang violence. How would you feel about that? Is that justice? If suddenly they made this law, if the legislative branch made this law, the executive branch is carrying it out, and they're saying they're targeting people between the ages of 12 and 17. They're profiling people between the ages of 12 and 17 and saying youth gangs are a problem. And because of that, if you're leaving your community, so if you live in Wetaskiwin, leave Wetaskiwin, you need to tell the government where you're going. Anybody have an issue with that? So in the United States, there's something called the Fourth Amendment. Canada, we don't have the Fourth Amendment, but we still have the same principles, and that's the idea, should we be private from government? So the government of Canada may be suggesting that the controlled movement of youth should assist in the reduction of violence. So they seem to have a quid pro quo understanding of we're doing this because it benefits us here. We're doing this here because of this. They seem to be trying to justify it, right? So as a citizen in Canada, whether you're under the Ycga or whether you become an adult later, one of your most important relationships is that with the government. And the government continues to create new legislation that changes our relationship with them. And it's not fictional to think that governments could put into place acts like this. So a couple of key terms in the textbook connected to this chapter are fair and equitable. So after the break, when you have some textbook time, I'm going to ask you to define those terms. What does it mean that laws need to be fair? What does it mean that things need to be equitable? So those are two building blocks, two big rocks of this chapter that hopefully you leave here today knowing what they mean. So what do they mean? So there's other scenarios. So we're trying to give you some scenarios to to make the content a little more applicable, right? So imagine this scenario. Two youth are caught committing the same crime. The first youth remains anonymous when the crime appears on the front page of the local newspaper. The second youth has both a picture and a name published. Now, is that fair? Is that equitable treatment? As a youth, would you want your picture and name published in the Wetaskiwin Times Advertiser or the Pipestone Flyer saying, hey, Joey Smallwood of Millet, age 13, was caught vandalizing cars. So now everybody in your neighborhood is looking at you a little differently. And they're angry with you. And there's a lot of potential harm that could be directed towards you by your neighbors. Especially in a town like Millet where there is an absence of police. So one thing that the government of Canada has figured out is that they need to create a justice system that responds to youth crime, but understands that young offenders are not adult offenders. So the reality is we have youth crime in Canada, and youth crime is higher than adult crime per capita. So young people are more likely to commit crimes than adults. But the problem begins with the idea of, to what extent is it fair, is it equitable to treat them as you would adult offenders? So we'll look at concepts like justice system, which includes institutions and procedures for applying laws in society. Look at the intention of this Ycga, the Youth Criminal Justice Act. It replaced the former Young Offenders Act in 2003, and generally the Ycga focuses on rehabilitation of young criminals. So rehabilitation. So there's one thing called retribution, and then there's another thing called rehabilitation. Retribution is this idea that you have violated someone else, and they need to get payback. They need to get retribution. The community needs retribution because of the crimes that you committed. Rehabilitation is focused on preventing a chain of crime. Let's end this criminal activity. Let's rehabilitate the person so that we can deal with the root causes of the crime. Not just the consequences, the retribution part, but the rehabilitation to deal with the root problems of why this happened. So, vocabulary is key in this course. Hopefully you have the term rehabilitation down in your notes. And distinguishing it with retribution that I just went over. So here in Canada, youths are treated differently than adults by the Canadian justice system. All youth who come into conflict with the laws are dealt with under the Ycga. All adults must face the law as it is defined in the Criminal Code of Canada. There are similarities for sure, but there are going to be differences as well. And that's one thing to look for in the textbook. So the textbook's going to outline the objectives of the Ycga. It's going to give us some data to wrestle with to see to what extent is youth crime an issue here in Canada. And I think I'm going to leave that one there because these same political cartoons are in the next ones that I have too. So now we're going to look at a quick Prezi together that's going to do the same thing, just introduce this chapter. So what are we doing in this chapter? Well, we're going to look at the justice system. We're going to look at how much does our current justice system protect our society. Maybe you'll, at the end of chapter 2, you'll be like, you know what? Youth Criminal Justice Act, it's not enough of a deterrent. It's not stopping people from acting. A deterrent is something that stops you from acting. And you might be looking at the crime numbers and saying, there's no deterrence here. That we need a justice system not based on rehabilitation or even retribution, but maybe we need deterrence. So another focus of the justice system might be deterrence. So, on your notebook there, did you write down the word deterrence? So deterrence, retribution, rehabilitation, these are three of the primary goals of a justice system. And you might look at the data and say, maybe we need more deterrence to stop people from acting. So how much does our justice system protect society? Your conclusion doesn't have to be my conclusion. I just want to make sure that we're speaking in the same language. What are we doing to protect the innocent? What are we doing to ensure that those who break the law do face appropriate consequences? We'll look at the Youth Criminal Justice Act, we'll look at consequences for young people, and we'll look at the role of Canadian citizens and organizations like the John Howard Society. We'll define fair and equitable. We'll look at justice and the justice system. So the idea of fair and equitable is governed by rules that apply to everyone, taking into account individual needs and circumstances. That's what fair and equitable means. Fair and equitable means that the laws should be the same for everyone, but there are circumstances for each case that we need to consider. Justice is applying laws, and the justice system would be those institutions and procedures for applying those laws in our society. We're going to skip over some of the brainstorming stuff and the group stuff because we can't do that. So, Youth Criminal Justice Act. Some of the controversy surrounding the Youth Criminal Justice Act, or Ycga, is, is it meeting the needs of all four of these groups? So there are stakeholders in Canada, people that have an interest in the outcome of a trial. Obviously, the accused does. If I'm on trial, if I've committed a crime, then I have a stake in the outcome. I'm a stakeholder. I have an interest in what the judge or the jury decides. As the accused, I'm like, oh, what's going to happen to me? The victim has a stake in it too, right? They're a stakeholder. But so too does society at large. So in Canada, we often have in social media, there'll be announcements that a violent offender has been released back into general population in Edmonton or other communities. So there'll be a little warning, hey, Red Deer, be on the lookout, this guy is back in general population. Be aware that he's being released into general population under these conditions because he has this history of these crimes. It's very open, very, very, very transparent. But should it be that transparent for youth? If we have a new student that joins us and they're coming to a new community looking for a fresh start, should we, before that student arrives, be given a description of their criminal past? Would we be likely to provide them a opportunity for a fresh start? So we're going to skip some of this get up, move around the room stuff because we can't really do that. Some related terms are community service. So if you are found that you have committed a crime, then what's the punishment going to be? What's the retribution that society's going to achieve? Well, you might be sentenced to do some community service. Maybe you have to clean up a park. Maybe you have to collect garbage. Maybe you have to give speeches at schools about why you shouldn't be doing drugs. Community service is meant to be this idea that we're going to take the negative thing that happened, which was a crime that you committed, and try to bring some positive back into your community that you've hurt. Trying to level out the scales here. The crime that you committed, we're going to try to make you do some good so that your community is more balanced out of your actions. Another term is criminal record, a permanent record of breaking the law, which is public information. criminal record can bar you from some jobs. So all of your teachers here at WCHS, none of us have criminal records, so we wouldn't be allowed to teach. Volunteer positions, usually with children, not if you have a criminal record. I have friends that can't travel outside of Canada because they have criminal records. So it's like, hey, dude, want to go to Vegas? Obviously not right now with the pandemic, and they're like, no, or I can't go to Vegas. You know I can't go to Vegas. It's like, oh man, well, have fun in the Vegas of Canada, right? Have fun at that new casino at the airport. We're going to Vegas. So there are consequences for our actions, including potentially a sentence, time in jail. So again, we're going to skip through some of this group activity stuff that we can't do. So there's definitely stages of the justice system that the chapter is going to outline for us. And this is straight out of the textbook, by the way. This visual is straight out of the textbook. So you're going to see it. It talks about rehabilitation, it talks about reintegration of people back into society, and it talks about what is the Ycga and what does it actually mean. So we do want you to, at the end of chapter 2, to be able to understand the Ycga, the intention of it, but also the application of it. That's why you'll have some charts like that in the textbook. This is just meant to be an overview of what we can expect to see. We'll skip the videos for now. I think we'll wait to watch those videos at a time and when we need a break from the book. So you know what? Maybe I'm going to pause it here, and rather than going out late for our break, maybe we'll go out now, and then when we get back, I'll have the textbook questions up on the board, and then when we hit a wall with the textbook questions, I will share some of these videos and also share some cartoons and sources that we can interpret so we can apply this information. So I'm going to end the video now. This is just an intro to chapter 2. Please exit through the grade 9 doors, and I'll see you out there in a minute.